I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Free and uncorrupted communication.
There are a lot of Americans who don't realize that international law, when it is set down in the form of treaties that have been signed and ratified by the United States, become the law of the United States under Article 6, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. That means, for example, that the Charter of the United Nations, which is a treaty, is a part of the supreme law of the land of the United States. And when that charter is violated, even by our government, it is a violation of the law of our country. And that's a very important concept, I believe, to keep in mind as you think about government policy and its relationship to international law. Our first keynote speaker today is a man who I have great respect for, a man who has dedicated his life to trying to find the means to bring international law to bear upon policy, and to do so with a clear expression of normative values so that he can write books and articles with themes of humane global governance, with themes of how to bring decency and dignity into the law and thereby into our social intercourse. I believe that Richard Falk is one of the really great professors of our time. And he had a 40-year career at Princeton University and some prior teaching before that, but at Princeton he was the Albert Milbank Professor of International Law and Practice. And in that capacity, he not only taught, but he wrote widely. His books have been used throughout the country, I think in classrooms throughout the country, and throughout the world, where he has also been very active in going out and speaking about these issues. So Richard Falk has recently become the chair of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. We're very proud to have him acting in that capacity, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you a good friend and a great scholar, Richard Falk.
Thanks, David, very much. I hope I can not disappoint those that heard these extravagant words. And let me say and echo, I think, what David said in his earlier remarks, that this is a very critical moment, I think, to talk about or to think about both issues of security and of the importance of international law to the way in which a powerful country like the United States carries forth its policies in the world. And we are at a rather strange moment, I think, in a deeper sense, if one reflects on two sets of converging world developments at the moment that have captured our political and moral imaginations. I think we should understand that there is a profound crisis of security that is gripping the world. I speak first of all of the events that have involved this sniper in Washington the last few weeks, and also simultaneously are unfolding in Moscow with the hostages that have been seized at this musical theater which portrays musicals. It should be remembered that the modern state came into being because it promised to establish internal order, and it was capable. It came into being against a background in the pre-modern Europe of internal chaos, pervasive criminality that no political authorities could control. There were no strong central institutions. And here, at this moment of hyper-modernity, we see two of the principal states in the world that are virtually paralyzed in their capacity to sustain internal order. And at this same time, in the post-September 11th context, we see the crisis of the territorial state in its global dimension, because what was established by the September 11th attacks was the acute vulnerability of the most powerful territorial state to this concealed terrorist network that operates on a non-territorial basis and provides no traditional way in the modern world of responding to a violent adversary. In other words, to the extent that war served as a basis for some kind of stability, it presupposed a territorial. Sorry, I must have gone too far. It presupposed a response that was based on a collision of territorial sovereign communities. And even though the institution of war itself came under severe criticism as a result of the world wars and the emergence of nuclear weapons, it was, to the extent that it served any stabilizing purpose, it was based on the fact that the adversaries were territorial communities. Here, with a concealed network, the response is almost inherently one that ignores territorial limits, sovereign rights of other states. The United States' response to September 11th, in effect, claimed the prerogative to use force anywhere in the world where it thought the dangers that were associated with terrorism existed. And this is an annihilation of the modern idea of a world of sovereign states. So both internally and externally, the coherence of the modern world premised on territorial sovereignty has been drawn into severe doubt. And that, in a way, is part of the context for what I'm trying to express at the beginning of this symposium today, which is perhaps, in some sense, the reverse of my title, the title From National Security to Global Security. I think we're at a moment where it's from global security to national security, or at least that's one way of thinking about this historic moment in a more accurate way. At this time, our government in Washington is insisting that the United Nations Security Council give it a mandate to wage a non-defensive war against Iraq, validated by the language of preemption, but not empirically persuasive on that level. The idea of the reasonable idea of preemption presupposes a genuine threat that is visibly imminent. As far as I think most overwhelming consensus among objective observers is that Iraq is a threat only to its own people. It is effectively not only contained, but it's been decisively weakened both by the Gulf War and by more than a decade of the most punitive sanctions ever imposed on any country in international history. And even before 1991, it should be remembered that it was unable to deal with Iran with U.S. backing, despite the fact that Iran was in the midst of revolutionary turmoil. So that the fantasy of Iraq as posing a threat is something that you have to be an extreme secular fundamentalist to believe in, because it's so far removed from the empirical reality. But what this in effect is, and this is what makes it extremely serious beyond the crisis of the moment, is that it is giving an ultimatum to the United Nations. And the ultimatum puts the United Nations in an untenable position. It is really saying to the Security Council, either you rubber stamp U.S. geopolitics, or we will act anyway, and the irrelevance and impotence of the United Nations will be clear for the world to see. Now, this is a true Hobson's choice. Which is the worst of these two courses of action? Is it better to have an impotent United Nations with integrity, or a debased United Nations that has a nominal relevance to issues of war and peace? And the United States, as the leading country in the world, in many respects the architect of the United Nations, is putting this organization in this dreadful situation at this time. And it should be understood, I think, beyond this, that the question of Iraq policy is not only a procedural question. It's not only a question of getting the authorization of the U.S. Congress and the United Nations to wage war. It's also a substantive question. And the substantive question is whether to respect the fundamental norms of international law that were embodied in the UN Charter, and which in effect pledged the renunciation of uses of force that could not be justified as self-defense in response to a prior armed attack. The Charter is very clear on this conception of the international use of force, and neither the U.S. Congress nor, in a sense, the UN Security Council can mandate an illegal war. And in that sense, the idea that because Congress has given its approval, that makes the war legal is itself a misunderstanding of the degree to which the United States, as by its own constitution, as David mentioned in his introductory remarks, is pledged to respect validly ratified treaties as the supreme law of the land. And there's little disagreement that the UN Charter is probably the most important treaty that the United States has ever accepted. And so to have the idea that Congress has the authority to ignore that charter is a misunderstanding. And it's a further misunderstanding, of course, for the president to say that his recourse to Congress is a matter essentially of politics, not legal requirement. If you remember, he said a few months ago, he will consult with Congress, but he need not do so. And this again raises the question that was raised during the Vietnam period of the imperial presidency. That is, a president who claims that he can commit the country to war without the legal authorization of Congress. And beyond that, it does pose the question of what happens if the Security Council gives its blessing to such a war that violates its own charter. Unlike the U.S. Legal system, the International Court of Justice decided in the Lockerbie case that the Security Council is the highest interpreter of its own obligations. There is no judicial review of Security Council decisions. So in effect, it means that from a formal point of view, that the Security Council can authorize an unlawful war. But of course, that would undermine, to a very considerable degree, the legitimacy of the organization. And it seems to me it is a crisis of that goes to the roots of this effort after World War II to condition national security on a framework of law and institutions that seeks to complement what states do by an idea of emerging global security. And it's that framework that was so hopefully articulated after World War II that we are placing in jeopardy at this time by the way in which we are proceeding. And part of that jeopardy is to insist that if the United Nations doesn't pass, the UN Security Council doesn't pass a resolution which in effect allows the United States to decide when to wage war against Iraq, the so-called hidden trigger within the resolution text that now is before the Security Council. If it doesn't do that, then the United States will act on its own. And President Bush has been indicating in his campaign speeches around the country that he's losing patience with the United Nations, and that in effect the organization is only as valid as its willingness to support U.S. foreign policy in this context, which is, of course, an annihilation of the whole idea that state sovereignty is subject to this collective process, and particularly subject to it when there isn't an issue of survival and self-defense that's at stake. I'm reminded of the lines of Bertolt Brecht's very well-known poem written in response to the suppression of an uprising in East Germany in communist times. Brecht's words were, the secretary of the Writers' Union had leaflets distributed in the Stalin Alley stating that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government and could win it back only by redoubled efforts. Would it not be easier in that case for the government to dissolve the people and elect another? That seems not so far from the analogy of dissolving the UN and establishing another if it doesn't follow the guidelines that are set forth by the White House. What is particularly sad about this situation, and why it deserves, I think, this stress beyond its current relevance, is that it seems to be overcoming a series of golden opportunities that emerged in the last part of the 20th century. These opportunities were moves toward a less sovereignty-oriented form of security that would justify, I think, the phrase that there was indeed a transition from national to global security. Let me mention three of these very quickly in order to give some substance to this claim. The first and the least noticed was the degree to which Mikhail Gorbachev, in his leadership of the Soviet Union, made the most visionary proposals to the United Nations and to the world of any important political leader since Woodrow Wilson. He proposed a treaty for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. He proposed all countries, including his own and the United States, all the permanent members of the Security Council, accepting the commitment to resolve all their disputes by recourse to the International Court of Justice. And he proposed adopting a systematic global approach to such global problems as the environment. The world was so focused on the internal Soviet developments that there was no resonance for these initiatives, even though I think they were genuinely proposed and, had they been acted upon, could have led us in a very different direction at the end of the Cold War and ushered in a period of political reconstruction and legal innovation rather than the kind of sort of desultory response to the end of the Cold War that occurred. The second of these golden opportunities was in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the presidencies of the first George Bush and Bill Clinton. There were opportunities to exert American leadership in a constructive way. And that should have involved, in my view, at the very least, an effort to probe the prospects for nuclear disarmament and the prohibition, a regime prohibiting all weapons of mass destruction for all states. There was a brief moment during the first Gulf crisis in 1990-91 where when then President Bush talked about a new world order, and there was a sense that maybe, despite his dislike of what he had called the vision thing, that despite that, he was being forced by events to take a more creative approach to global issues. But it was clear in the aftermath of the Gulf War that this was just a tactic to mobilize support for the war itself. And as one high official, his ambassador to the UN had put it, once the war was over, we put the New World Order back on the shelf. it was not something that, in other words, the United States was interested in pursuing. And Clinton, unfortunately, did no better. He basically delivered the message to the UN that it should downsize. He used a sort of Wall Street terminology, proposing downsizing and greater budgetary efficiency without any, and that was at the 50th anniversary of the UN. And he also ignored the prohibitions on the use of force in the response to the 1998 embassy bombings attacking Sudan and Afghanistan without any real foundation in some kind of sense that this was a reasonable response to the sort of events that had occurred. In other words, the opening at the end of the Cold War had given the leadership in Washington an opportunity that it didn't respond to. And this is unlike most of the innovations in the world that have created important positive developments have taken place in the aftermath of war. After World War I, the League of Nations; after World War II, the United Nations. But after the Cold War, nothing. See, and that, to my mind, is the great loss of opportunity. Now, finally, in the third and most important emerging opportunities occurred as a result of a movement from below, a popular movement that was basically a movement of NGOs and social activists around the world, and was dedicated to what I would call humane global governance. It takes inspiration, I think, from that embattled great Burmese leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, who said, "Sometimes it is better to have the peoples of the world on your side than the governments of the world." And the 1990s witnessed a dramatic rise of a grassroots popular movement that put forth, that achieved some quite extraordinary results. It first of all established its presence at the UN global conferences, the global summit in the Earth Summit in Brazil in 1992, the Human Rights Conference in Vienna in 93, the Population Conference at Cairo in 94, and the Social Summit and Women's Conferences in 1995. At all of those conferences, the presence of popular movements represented very vivid experiments in global democracy and were vehicles for the participation of the peoples of the world in protecting their own view of what security entailed. And then I think what was also happening in the 1990s was an unprecedented recognition of an obligation to redress historic grievances. One had the Holocaust victims being recognized after so many decades. Indigenous peoples were beginning to be heard around the world in terms of the injustices that they had experienced through dispossession and what amounted to genocide in many contexts. Comfort women in Asia, many issues of this sort were suddenly visible in the post-Cold War world and were being, and there was some degree of redress of grievances being accorded. Third development that's of great importance also was the rise of human rights to a place of prominence on the policy agenda of important states, and a recognition that the legitimacy of a government depended on its adherence to human rights to a significant degree. An emphasis, in other words, emerged on what might be called responsible sovereignty as distinct from unconditional sovereignty. And the Secretary Generals of the UN in this period gave support to this idea, perhaps most eloquently the current one, Kofi Annan. And this idea of the importance of human rights in relation to political legitimacy gave rise to claims that the international community had an obligation to protect people who were being victimized by their own governments in extreme ways, that there was an obligation, in effect, a duty, in effect, to engage in humanitarian intervention in situations where genocide was threatened. Kosovo was perhaps the high watermark of this development. There are problems in these areas. They're not unmixed blessings, but they showed a normative direction of development in international society that I think was very hopeful. In further development was the revival of the Nuremberg idea that individuals are accountable for crimes of state, and that it was important to pursue such individuals. The Pinochet case gave a lot of visibility to this idea, as did the prosecutions of people accused of crime in relation to the breakup of former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And this, in turn, fueled a popular movement that collaborated with governments to create the political foundation for the International Criminal Court. And as has been said throughout this weekend, that's a major institutional development, probably second only to the United Nations in its potential importance, not its actual importance at this point, but its potential importance. And finally, I think, there was a very important anti-globalization movement that took place in the 90s and was a vehicle for the expression of democratic values and the crucial idea that global security was a matter of overcoming poverty and economic oppression and deprivation, as well as preventing violence and war. And that economic and social rights were just as important as civil and political rights. So that it was this group of developments in the 1990s that had the possibility of really transforming the way in which security is pursued in the world, and is why I think it is appropriate to say that it was an emerging normative revolution. And the question that I will stop with and leave you with is whether the events of 9/11 and the aftermath, the response to 9/11, has derailed this normative revolution, or whether what we are witnessing is merely a detour, and that the energies that accounted for this development are still active enough in the political movements that gave rise to these developments at the end of the 20th century, that they will reemerge, perhaps with a stronger anti-war emphasis, but still seeking the same levels of transformation in international life. Let's hope that the future does not belong to some other words of the playwright poet Brecht, who I quoted earlier, when he said that his fear was that the world will be controlled by the thoughtless who never doubt and the thoughtful who never act. And let us hope that we can find a way to have the thoughtless less active and the thoughtful more formidable. Thank you very much. I do think that at the end of World War II, in the Truman period, there was a kind of automaticity between what the U.S. wanted in the world and what the UN did. Remember that this was a period before the Third World essentially existed as a force within the United Nations. It was a period in which there was a clear line of tension between East and West, but the West had the control of the UN in terms of the key symbolic issues. So, to be fair to the more recent leaders, it's not clear that in the Truman era we would have been very cooperative with the United Nations had it seemed to be challenging U.S. foreign policy initiatives of a fundamental sort. And so part of the drift away from the UN, and it has been a steady drift, has been the fact that the organization is not as, it's no longer a Western American-led organization. It has many different centers of diverse opinion, which is what one would want in a world organization that represents the world. See, another thing that alienated a lot of the early supporters of the UN was the seeming opposition of the UN to Israel and what Israel was doing in relation to the Palestinian issue. That and that rose to its height when the Third World adopted the Palestinian cause as a symbolic cause, second only to the apartheid issues in the 70s and 80s. And the United States saw itself as the ally of this embattled Israel within the context of the UN, and therefore saw itself as being, in a sense, no longer able not only to control the organization, but it couldn't really muster very much support for its positions. And then I'll just mention one third development. You remember that the United States conducted a long campaign to keep mainland China out of the organization and to have Taiwan represent the whole of China. Finally, after many years of effort, there was a vote that replaced Taiwan by the Beijing government as the representative of China, and Third World delegates danced in the aisles of the UN General Assembly to express their joy at being able to overcome this American opposition to the way in which China was treated. They didn't care so much about China. What they cared about was the idea that they could challenge effectively and successfully this American position that had seemed so unacceptable to them, to the rest of the world. So I think there have been those series, because it didn't start with this Bush administration, didn't start with the early Clinton, or it was a steady process. In the Reagan years, too, the UN was under consistent attack, and even at the end of the Carter presidency, Moynihan, who was the American representative at the UN, he made several speeches strongly attacking the Third World sort of majority that wasn't paying the bills, but it was challenging the sorts of positions that the United States was adopting. It's very hard to tell because it depends a little bit on what happens in the... There is definitely a backlash, definitely a preoccupation, because one thing I didn't mention was the degree to which the current American leadership is seen as embarking on a project of global domination. And the militarization of space is part of this. If you read the West Point speech that President Bush gave, and also the new national security strategy statement of the president, they all say the United States will achieve such military dominance that it is not worthwhile for any other country to even waste its resources in challenging it. That's an extraordinary claim, never made before by any country in history. And in effect, it's saying to the world, forget your own security. We'll take care of that if you behave yourself, and use your energies and your resources to compete economically and in developing your own society. Now that, of course, is in a sense, telling the world, the rest of the world, and it doesn't distinguish between enemies and friends. This applies to everyone. That we are the custodians of your security, and that historically is likely to generate a movement of resistance, first of all, by states, and one can anticipate at least the possibilities of alliances between China and Europe, between Russia and China, all kinds of possibilities. And you notice, if you've been reading the American and European literature, there's an increasing emphasis on what is being called the real clash of civilizations, which is supposed to be between Europe and the United States. And one formulation of this clash is that Europe is weak and therefore is law-oriented. The United States is strong and therefore power-oriented. There's an interesting piece by a guy named Kagan, I think his name is, in a global policy journal, not global policy, I forget the name of the journal, so that you have that response, you have a kind of possibility of an effort at a balance of new balance of power that would, in a sense, be very diversionary from the kind of normative projects that I was mentioning, because it would create a new arms race, new rivalries, new preoccupations. But then you also have the Porto Alegre phenomenon in terms of the global democracy movement that I think will try to and will have success in expanding its support at grassroots levels around the world. See, I think China and Russia are at the moment being offered by Washington the prospect of being junior partners in this global dominance game. And the question is whether they want to accept that status. And the Iraq issue is a key symbolic test of which way their elites or their leadership will decide. Will they go along? See, they have incentives, economic incentives, and tactical incentives. Both China and Russia are faced with their own internal armed opposition movements, the Chechens being a dramatic example for the Russians, and Xinjiang province in China, in Western China. So there was an initial, I think there was an initial solidarity with the United States as far as the response to September 11th was concerned. And that was a genuine solidarity because in one sense, I think President Bush was correct that this attack was an attack on the state system as such, as well as on the United States. And that states were threatened by this kind of non-territorial violence that seemed so formidable suddenly. But once this has been extended now into the domain of traditional interstate violence, in which Iraq is an example of, then I think there's much less, I think there's virtually no support, no genuine support, aside from perhaps Blair's Britain, for the American policy. So I think there is a likelihood that China and Russia will both have very significant internal debates that will determine their own futures in a very fundamental way as to whether to resist the American global project or to become subordinate partners in its implementation. Well, I think from an American point of view, I think it's a very self-destructive path that we are pursuing at the moment. And I've often quoted the famous maxim of Lord Acton that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Here, the United States finds itself undeterred in the world. And that's that is a circumstance of unlimited power. And one of the reasons that international law is so important at this point is that the only limits on the exercise of this power at the present time are the limits that we would impose on ourselves. And that's why it's so important that we adhere to this culture of respect for law in our foreign policy as well as in our domestic relationships, the state-society relationships. I see that what I had answered to the earlier question about, I think that there will be resistance to this project of global domination that will take the form of a very dangerous effort to create a new balance of power that will lead to an arms race with these high technology weapons. We were lucky to survive the Cold War without a breakdown of the security system that was operating under the framework of deterrence. It was luck, good luck. The human institutions are too fallible to handle these weapons of mass destruction over an unlimited stretch of time. And so I think if there's the threat of preemptive war against Iraq at this point, one can only imagine what the United States might do when it saw really more genuine threats to its position of global dominance emerging around the world as a result, or more widespread chaotic violence of the sort that has gripped the Washington area in recent weeks. Remember that I meant seriously the point that I started with, that the state, even the most powerful state, is threatened from below, as well as having this acute vulnerability to the concealed terrorist networks. Both forms of fundamental instability. The legitimacy of the state depends on its capacity to maintain order. And in a democratic society, it depends on the capacity to maintain order without encroaching on democratic values. Can it do that? See, Moscow never had the experience of Chechen rebellion during Soviet times. See, and can democracy cope with these new forms of threat? It's a very fundamental question, and my view is the only way to cope with them is, instead of seeking global domination, which will only aggravate these resentments, is to work towards some form of humane global governance that works toward satisfies the legitimate grievances that peoples around the world have. That doesn't guarantee that every form of extremism will disappear, but what it does promise is that the sort of resonance that political extremism now has, because anti-Americanism is so widespread, will not exist any longer, and then it will be possible to isolate those forms of pathological extremism that persist. You can see this in the effort to end the civil war in Ireland, where there still is violence because remnants of the IRA won't accept a compromise, and remnants of the established order. And you'll always have that problem. It will be true in the Palestinian-Israel situation too. You'll never get a situation where both sides, the totality of both sides, accepts a fair compromise. The most you can hope for is 90 to 95% of each side accepting that, and then treating those that resist as pathological opponents of a just and fair order. The media has played, I think, an unfortunate role in sort of mobilizing the society for this kind of war. We don't really know how significant are the capabilities of Iraq with respect to biological and chemical weapons. But they don't, the most, I think, reliable assessments are that they're fairly modest in terms of their capacity to inflict damage on other countries. But beyond that question of capabilities is the question of intent. And there's no evidence in Saddam Hussein's career of bloody rule that he is prepared to take risks that would ensure his own annihilation. The Soviet Union was a much more dangerous adversary during the Cold War, but it was always subject to that calculation that if it did anything provocative, it would be destroyed as a functioning society. Iraq has not, the only thing it could do is, if it is struck, it might, as a dying gesture, try to inflict as much pain as it could. But if it's left alone, or if it's actually given a kind of a normalization process that lets it behave like a normal country, there's no threat that it could pose to anyone unless it's prepared to commit, is a martyrdom, and there's, as I say, there's no evidence at all that Saddam Hussein is a martyr of the sort that was involved in the attacks on the Trade Center on September 11th. So it's a category mistake. The CNN and the media has tried to make us think that Iraq is like Al-Qaeda. See, if Osama bin Laden was the leader of Iraq, I could see myself supporting some version of the Bush approach. And if he was, there would be no resistance in the Security Council to the effort to take very strong coercive steps, because you would have to be a fool to wait until a bin Laden acquired nuclear weapons. But you have to make distinctions if you want to live in the real world. And one of the distinctions is between a genocidal terrorist organization and a state that has a brutal leader but a rational actor in the international sense. Well, that again, Burley, I think is quite contested whether he... Remember that the inspection that was maintained during the 1990s was the most intrusive inspection that was ever authorized on a global level, and that it was by testimony of the several of those who participated in the inspection quite effective in its scrutiny of what capabilities illicit capabilities Iraq possessed. And every country, every government, including our own, doesn't accept the idea that its security should be overridden by the international community. I mean, in a way, the Gulf War peace was the first punitive peace since Versailles. The Versailles Treaty after World War I, which had taught, we had thought, the world the lesson that if you impose a punitive peace, you generate an extremist response and deep resentment. This is a much more punitive peace. We learned the lesson of Versailles after World War II. We adopted an entirely different reconstructive approach that worked quite successfully. Now one has to ask, well, maybe punitive peace is not good for first world countries, but it's okay for third world countries. You know, maybe that it was a sort of redefinition of what the lesson of Versailles was. But I think that Iraq is prepared to accept a reasonable regime of inspection. Remember that it was clear that the U.S. was using the inspection process to obtain targeting information. Now, what sovereign state can accept the idea that espionage being conducted in order to wage a war against it in the future should be given a green light? See, we haven't, again, the media has failed to point out the complexity from the point of view of establishing a reasonable inspection mechanism. And I think he, you know, Paris de Cuellar in his memoirs talks about visiting Saddam just prior to the Gulf War in 1991 and saying that Saddam went to the map and said, "Tell me what to do, and I'll do it." And Paris de Cuellar said that he was instructed not to say anything but to deliver the ultimatum. And that convinced Saddam that he was going to be attacked anyway. And if he was going to be attacked anyway, then it was better not to withdraw before the deadline, because then at least he'd have the sense of having resisted. So it's hard to know, but my sense is that he is a relatively cautious international actor. He was pushed into the Iran war by the U.S. We wanted Iran to be attacked because of our opposition to Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution. In the Kuwait war, we gave very ambiguous signals. Kuwait didn't fulfill its obligations to Iraq that were undertaken during the Iran-Iraq war. And so it's not as clear as the media would have us think it is, that this is a reasonable demand being directed at Iraq.